Diplomatic Academy. It is my pleasure to welcome you all and all the distinguished speakers of tonight's event. It's called a public roundtable. I am simply the host. I will pass on the floor then to the main organizers. But let me just say as an introduction, I much enjoy that we are not talking again only about the Western Balkans, or only about the Eastern Partnership, or only about the problems that we have with our European global strategy, but we are trying to look for commonalities, if you understand this evening correctly. I do think that the EU global strategy is, if I may say that, a success which I did not expect it would be a success. And maybe it's one of the questions why it is a success. Some people say it is a success because it's so vague and it's not really giving you an idea of where we should go. Other people say it's a success because in spite of the fact that we don't have a common foreign and security policy, we do have a paper for a common security and foreign policy. And I have to admit, they may be right in saying this. But maybe this is where we are, and the title of tonight is called Unity and Disunity in Europe, and that's certainly where we are. But I much appreciate that this is a common discussion on these issues with such a distinguished group of speakers here. Certainly there is one basic difference, and as an official Austrian I have to say this at the beginning, the difference between the Western Balkans and the Eastern Partnership is that in one case we talk about membership of the European Union, in the other case we talk about partnership. Partnership is something else from membership, but maybe we don't know what the European Union will look like in 10, 15 years. Maybe there is some sort of overlapping of concepts coming also to the European Union, but that's also already more than someone who is just the host should say at this very moment. I welcome you all and wish us an interesting evening.
Your Excellencies, Mesdames et Messieurs, liebe Freunde, I would like to start by extending a warm welcome to you on behalf of the organizers of this conference. The event of tonight builds on two sister initiatives launched by the Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe and its network of partners. The first initiative is the Western Balkan Reflection Forum, which was organized for the first time in Paris in 2015 to support the Berlin process. It focuses on regional cooperation in Western Balkans and the enlargement policy. The second one is the Eastern Partnership Reflection Forum, launched in Minsk in 2017, whose emphasis lies on regional cooperation in Eastern Europe and on the Caucasus. These two initiatives offer a platform of exchange, where participants can discuss the shaping of Europe and the Union's closest neighborhood. These platforms are special. They encourage a strategic, policy-oriented reflection on regional cooperation and European integration that goes beyond the agenda of EU summits. They create room to think about Europe outside existing frameworks. These platforms, moreover, bring together think tankers from all over Europe, from Portugal to Russia, from Serbia to Finland, from Switzerland to Georgia. They create room to think about Europe in an inclusive manner. And these platforms try to bring think tankers closer to national and European representatives and citizens across Europe. Thinking about Europe, after all, is not the sole prerogative of think tankers and political representatives. The event of tonight builds on these two initiatives. It is at the intersection of these two initiatives. What can we learn from the EU's experience in the Western Balkans on the one side, and in Eastern Europe and on the Caucasus on the other side? What knowledge can we cross-fertilize? What do the Western Balkan countries and the Eastern partners expect from the EU? and how to foster democracy, peace, and unity in a wider Europe almost 30 years after the Charter of Paris. This question has guided the work of the Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe for many years now. The organization was founded exactly 40 years ago by Austrian Chancellor Kreisky and French Prime Minister Chirac with one goal: enabling France and Austria to join forces in the striving of the idea of rapprochement in Europe. This is what the Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe was doing in the 80s when it fostered economic cooperation between Eastern and Western Europe. And this is what it does today, thanks to its two sister initiatives and its participating experts. Tomorrow, 70 of them, coming from 30 different countries, will come together for a working session in this framework. I would especially like to welcome our international guests who are joining us already tonight. In conclusion, I would like to thank the partners behind these two initiatives: the Centre International de Formation Européenne, l'Institut Français de Relations Internationales, l'Istituto Affari Internazionale, and the German Institute of International and Security Affairs, as well as the partners behind today's and tomorrow's event, the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, the Competence Center for Black Sea Region Studies, the Renner Institute, the International Institute for Peace, and others. And above all, I would like to thank our keynote speakers and panelists in advance for sharing their knowledge with us. And a special thank you to Deputy Minister Morari and Ambassador Bremminger for joining us tonight. I'm looking forward to an interesting and informative evening. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, as President of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, I also want to welcome you heartily and just want to express my pleasure of seeing or looking into a round of so many interested people interested in the relationship of, western parts of Europe and eastern parts of Europe. I'm supposed to make a keynote speech, or I would say it shouldn't be a keynote speech because we have so many experts that really will go into the depth. At the beginning, I rather would say I should maybe try to make a few remarks, introductory remarks on this situation. And usually when I do it, I try to look back a little bit into history. I usually try to look a little bit at the maps, looking at geography. I try, to get a feeling for a sense for situations and not only to make an analytical analysis. So if I try to look back into history, I would say, especially in this year, of course, you cannot talk about Eastern Europe, about the Eastern European Partnership and the countries without looking to the situation, what has happened 100 years ago. Certainly, this moment of the destruction of at least three universal empires has shaped a political situation where we still can feel the consequences. What do I mean? With the end of World War I, the Russian Tsarist Empire was destroyed, Austria-Hungary was destroyed, and the Osmanic Empire was destroyed. And in addition of it, also the German emperor lost at least his function as an emperor, and the country was reduced and also disempowered. Insofar, the question, what followed? 100 years ago, there started a new order within Europe that overcame the old universal order that was more or less designed very much due to the religious groups. You had the Tsar as the highest representative of Orthodox Christianity in the political sense. You had the Emperor of Austria-Hungary as the highest representative of the Catholic world, and you had the German Emperor as the representative of the reformist or Protestant world. And you had also in Istanbul the Turkish emperor, the Sultan, at the same time as the Caliph, as the representative of Islam. And this certainly was one of the means that used to bring those, or to keep those countries together, and also to find some kind of order in between. I do not want to go too far into details. But, of course, the destruction of it brought a new order. And if you ask which one, it was due to the Wilsonian order, a nationalistic order in Europe, when Europe should be shaped newly alongside ethnic, more or less ethnic lines and borders in between. Of course, this didn't work out the way it should have, and we all could feel the consequences in World War II, in the period in between, and even afterwards. And when specialists talk about this question about what has happened and why did it work out this way, and what are the consequences, and what is now the situation in this Europe in between European Union and Russia, you could say, if you want to simplify it. Then you have to say, okay, certainly there are dependencies to the past. And one is, if I ask myself, what is interesting about this situation and this consciousness of being a nation on the one hand, on the one side, and what is so significant about the overall situation in between Western Europe, if I call this way, the European Union, and Russia on the other hand, I would say, if I go to the countries, what do I feel? When I go to Minsk, I do not feel that this is a Eurasian nation. It's a purely European nation, probably due to the history dating back to the Lithuanian Greater Duchies and so on. And if I go to Ukraine, I do not feel that this is a Eurasian entity. And the same I do not feel in Moldova. And even if I go to the South Caucasian countries, and even if I reflect that in geography, you probably all of you have learned that the border between Europe and Asia would be the Caucasus. I do not feel Eurasian in Georgia. I do not feel so in Armenia. And I do not feel so even in Azerbaijan. And insofar, what we should be aware that, of course, the general sense, the general tendency of those countries, if they really feel in a similar way as I do, probably is much, much more European than Eurasian. And this shows already one of these questions and one of these discussion points between Moscow and Brussels, if you want to take it in this respect. So what are the consequences? What could consequences be? I reflect also that if you look at the map and you compare the Eurasian map at the beginning of the 20th century and at the end of the 20th century, you can see that Russia lost practically all the regions it had won from the end of the 18th century and during the 19th century, except some regions in the Far East. But all the others that were won by Moscow from the end of the 18th century and during the 19th century, they got lost and they got independent. This rather would be an indication, not only because they had a formal different status as so-called states and so on, but also that probably the integration of power was not strong enough anymore. And insofar, you can see that, well, history shows us a little bit that there was a strong tendency to be something different than belonging to the Russian Empire. This is what we have to be aware. And I just want to talk about it because I see at the other side, of course, the tendencies in Moscow, to reintegrate some of the countries and their systems, or at least integrate them partly into sort of an empire or a great power. The question is, how should we react from the Western side? How should Russia react? I would say, if we try to look at it from the Western side, from the European Union side, I would say the most important thing is that we look at it from our own system. Our own system is value-based, is rule-based, and is standard-based. And therefore, the question of integration towards West or East certainly will depend very much on these aspects, on values, on standards, and on rules. Rules that really are followed by the people. And if we try, on the other hand, to look at this tendency that comes from the East, it is absolutely understandable for me that Russian elites will more or less react in a way they do react. But what is the consequence? The consequence probably will not be more integration into the Russian world or something like that, but rather getting into more distance. Just as you could follow the situation in Ukraine after the use of military force, that was for me at least more or less the beginning of a strong Ukrainian nationalism that had not existed before. Security in Europe is dependent on this relation between EU on the one hand, Russia on the other hand, and also this Europe in between. What can we do to make it more secure, not only for Western Europe, but also for the East, for the Russians, and especially also for the countries in between, for our Eastern Partnership countries? I would say one of the most important aspects probably is to lower pressure or to act by low pressure. As long as there is pressure from one side, we will get pressure from the other side. As long as we try to get into a competition, the competition will rise and will make it very difficult for everybody. How can we overcome such situations? I hope to hear some recipes, and I'm sure we will get many ideas and informations. But I would say most important seems to be for me a step-by-step approach. If you look at the situation in those 6 countries, it is so different, and we also know we have the structure of 3 associated countries, and on the other hand, 3 other countries which do not have an association with the EU, but just a cooperation agreement, and even this is different between Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, or Belarus, I would say. And insofar, there will be a different way from country to country, more or less. And the question, how far we should go, is pretty simple. Generally speaking, I would say, of course, Europe has to be open for those countries. There can be no doubt about it. This is in our constitution. And if Europe should forget this, this would mean that we would forget about our own values, that we would only become Sunday preachers, not more and not less. And therefore, I would say, this should be more or less the guideline for our politics from the European side. Step by step, slowly, and always looking at the other side, what is coming from this side, where are the concerns, and where are also the challenges, and where the hopes and the opportunities. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to get into the depth of this problem and to hear many, many other aspects in this respect. Thank you very much.
Mr. Birmingham, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Herr Director Briggs, Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation to take part in this very timely event. In today's fast-changing world, our rule-based European security order has come under tremendous pressure. At the same time, the space for East-West dialogue is contracting. The deepening tensions in East-West relations since 2014 have reshaped security priorities throughout Europe and the wider OSCE region. But they present a particularly intricate challenge for those countries caught between competing and apparently mutually exclusive integration models. In this climate, every step along the path that the EU's Eastern partners take is contested. The pressure to align with one side or the other is strong. Internal divisions over value directions and political choices have become intertwined with geopolitical factors. And demands for democratization and reforms have in some cases become entangled with concerns of sovereignty and security. Changing European security priorities and deteriorating East-West relations have also had significant implications for the Western Balkans. While attention shifted eastwards due to the crisis in and around Ukraine, EU integration in Southeast Europe stagnated. This has opened space. It has opened space for non-EU actors who have become emboldened to challenge efforts to integrate Southeast Europe into Euro-Atlantic structures. Domestically too, questions have emerged in some circles about the benefits of European Union association. These developments coincide with continued ambiguity and, if anything, greater skepticism towards further enlargement among EU member states and EU citizens. The growth of populism in the aftermath of the 2008 financial and economic crisis, the migration influx in 2015, Brexit, and the emergence of new security challenges have all raised levels of uncertainty and anxiety about what the future holds. And I must admit that against this rather gloomy backdrop, promoting inclusive and cooperative approaches to security is challenging, very challenging. But we cannot wait for the current turbulences in international politics to simply go away. This will not happen unless we take active steps towards dialogue and towards cooperation. Thanks to its comprehensive security concept and thanks to its inclusive membership, the OSCE remains uniquely placed to address at least some of the current challenges to European security. But it will be no surprise to you that constructive dialogue has also become a rare commodity within the OSCE. Mutual accusations and stock statements have replaced constructive criticism and a genuine search for common ground. This is in particular true for all of our formal dialogue platforms like the Permanent Council, the Forum for Security Cooperation. Due to the general lack of trust, an incremental approach to cooperation is probably the most realistic way forward. That means seeking convergence where possible and seizing opportunities to create space for informal dialogue. One important such initiative is the OSCE Structured Dialogue, launched at the Hamburg Ministerial Council at the end of 2016. The Structured Dialogue focuses on political military matters. This OSCE flagship initiative is a noteworthy attempt to rebuild at least some trust and confidence. State-owned and state-driven, this informal process has stimulated useful exchanges on threat perceptions, on force postures, and on military doctrine. It has also started to discuss practical steps to reduce military risks. Managing and thus reducing incidents in the OSCE area could help prevent an unwanted escalation caused by accident, which is a very real risk today. Enhancing the transparency of military exercises and restricting them near borders could alleviate some of the concerns. Through constructive engagement to address these urgent matters, I do hope the structured dialogue process may help to reinvigorate existing competence and security building measures. But it is eventually up to OSCE participating states to use the OSCE's inclusive platform to its full advantage. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, the main obstacle to restoring trust and cooperation in Europe today remains the crisis in and around Ukraine. Working toward a sustainable resolution of this crisis must be our top priority. When the crisis erupted, the OSCE was the only international organization accepted by all sides. Almost 5 years later, the OSCE continues to play a critical role, at least in managing the conflict, in making sure that it does not spin out of control, both through its special monitoring mission to Ukraine on the ground, and in particular in eastern Ukraine, and by facilitating the trilateral contact group that meets on a bi-weekly basis among the 5 signatories of the Minsk agreements. I'm convinced that achieving a peaceful settlement in Donbass is possible. I urge all who have influence on the sides to push harder to break the political stalemate and to get the signatories to comply with agreed measures. Ultimately, achieving sustainable peace in Eastern Ukraine hinges on political will. This is, of course, also true for other conflicts in the OSCE region, not least in the South Caucasus and in Moldova. In Moldova, however, the OSCE has contributed to brokering agreement on a package of confidence-building measures that make life better for people living on both sides of the Dniester River. These very concrete steps by Pristina and Tiraspol show that cooperation is possible, even after many years of deadlock. They also show that cooperation can lead to practical results, provided the international stakeholders pull together and provided the sides muster the political will to enable progress. And I'm confident that this positive dynamic in implementing the confidence-building measures will also give a new momentum to resolving the settlement-related issues. And I do hope that it also inspires greater will among the parties to resolve other conflicts in the OSCE region. The OSCE remains strongly engaged in Southeast Europe through its long-standing field presence and the active engagement of OSCE participating states from Southeast Europe in OSCE fora. With its proven track record of supporting work to strengthen institutions, consolidating democratic values, and fostering regional cooperation, the OSCE complements and amplifies the EU's efforts to consolidate reforms. We can work in such close partnerships with the EU in Southeast Europe because EU membership is a key priority that is espoused by all countries in the region. And despite of all the remaining challenges, we can also observe positive steps, not least the agreement between Skopje and Athens to resolve the name issue. This clearly has the potential of creating new positive dynamics in the region. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, in these uncertain times, strengthening security and stability throughout Europe should be the key priority for all countries, East and West. This certainly means upholding the basic principles and the commitments that are the foundation of European security since the Helsinki Final Act, the 1990 Paris Charter, and subsequent OSCE documents. We want to hold on to a collective, rule-based security order that benefits smaller as well as larger states in Europe. But it also means making use of the opportunities that currently exist to foster East-West dialogue. At the OSCE, I'm promoting the need for what I call unifying agenda. By this, I mean identifying issues where OSCE participating states have a common interest in joint action. I'll give you a few examples. Preventing violent extremism, dealing with large movements of refugees and migrants, cybersecurity, or combating the trafficking of people, drugs, small arms, and light weapons. These are but some areas of cooperation that can be built on. There are others, like the need for cooperation on climate change or sustainable energy. More could also be done to encourage connectivity, particularly economic interaction. Economic diplomacy and connectivity across a wider Europe, including EU and Eurasian Economic Union members, can foster inclusive economic growth and contribute to achieving our shared goals of peace and stability. Also in this field, the OSCE offers a platform that participating states and organizations within the OSCE region may want to consider using more extensively in the future. I'm convinced that constructive approaches and seizing opportunities for dialogue and cooperation are without alternative. Europe's security depends on our ability to overcome the present tensions and to build a new agenda, an agenda that can take us forward with patience and perseverance, one step at a time. No one is more attuned to this than the countries of the EU's Eastern Partnership. I'm again traveling to Minsk tomorrow, early in the morning by the way, to participate in a Munich Security Conference core group meeting. And one of the questions we will be discussing is whether substantive progress in the implementation of the Minsk agreements could serve as a catalyst for building renewed trust among the principal actors in the region. And I would like to answer this with an emphatic yes. But I'm painfully aware that substantive progress in implementation has so far eluded us. Yet, I'm cautiously optimistic that reason will eventually triumph. Before we get there, we should not give up pushing for dialogue as the only way out of the current crisis in Eastern Ukraine, the wider region, and Europe as a whole. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ambassador Breming, and thank you, Mr. Faslam, for your input. I now have the pleasure to hand over the floor to the moderator of the panel discussion, Hannes Swoboda, President of the International Institute for Peace.
Thank you very much. Thank you especially, of course, to Mr. Faslam and Ambassador Greminger for their keynote remarks or keynote speeches. I think what we saw, and this is, of course, my question to my partners here on the panel, there are many conflicts, and therefore maybe the title should have been called Unity and Disunities, because there are many disunities. Mr. Faslam said we should not be Sunday preachers. Well, sometimes I think we are Sunday preachers, de facto. Apropos Sunday, we looked at the last Sunday, which was yesterday, and saw the election in Hessen. Isn't it interesting? There is a big conflict across Europe about the refugee issue. More or less east and west, not exactly, maybe sometimes north and south. This conflict brought the German government into disarray and into conflicts about what to do. And then there was an election in not the biggest region in Germany, and one result was they wanted to sanction the German government because they all have all this discussion. And one part of losing voters for the government parties was, of course, going into the way of a party who is not accepting the values we speak about so much. And if you look to other countries, it's the same issue. So I think, how can we really honestly tell our friends in Southern Europe and in Eastern Europe that we want them to join us in time? Of course, it's a slow process and so on. If, on the other hand, inside European Union and inside European countries, those forces, political forces, who are against inviting others to come, are strengthened by election and election. So these are some of the questions we have to put. I am a very fervent supporter of enlargement process. I wasn't in the past, and I am now, because I don't think EU problems are resulting from enlargement, for example, the Eastern European countries. But as I'm a person, a very strong supporter, I have to ask the question: how can we seriously make promises if we have that internal divisions and disunities inside our own countries? And, for example, also the relationship to Russia. Now, if I understand it well, but Mr. Ferrocci can correct me. Inside also the Italian government, there are people who say, well, stop the sanctions. I'm not very fond of sanctions, but just to say you have very disunities and diverse positions, for example, on the relation to Russia, on these issues, and you can, of course, include also the Austrian government. So there are many questions, and I think we should be very honest in our discussion, not being Sunday preachers and say, yes, we are for it and wonderful. Of course, I'm not pleading for the forceful way of Mr. Trump or the new president in Brasilia, but somewhere in between we have to be honest, but still have a strategy what to do. For example, when Mr. Grimminger mentioned also Helsinki process, would Helsinki be possible today with all the divisions we have, or what would be the conditions to go forward? But that's just questions. Maybe some of the panelists will try to find another answer. So we have, first of all, Luisa Bielasiewicz, professor in University of Amsterdam, a typical Dutch name you have. Then we have Sredan Svijic, senior policy analyst, Open Society European Policy Institute in Brussels. Then we have Christophe Illion, professor, University of Oslo and Leiden, two French universities, and senior researcher, Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies. And then we have a real Italian, Ferdinando Nelle Ferrocci, president of Istituto Affari Internazionali, Rome. So what we have here, just to finalize my critical remarks, we have typical representatives of the cosmopolitan elite, which is contested by many political parties more and more. So what is your answer in view of the situation you have partly in your own country? How can we proceed honestly? How can we go forward? Or just do we have to stop and say, let's reflect? But that will be not a very positive answer, for example, to the Deputy Minister of Moldova, because she wants to go forward and not stop or go back. Luisa, you're the first.
Thank you very much. I don't think this is
It should
on.
work. It should work.
Is it on? Yes? No? Okay. So first, let's swap microphones, much better. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me to share some of my thoughts, and also thank you to our esteemed keynote speakers, because I think you also helped us frame the discussion that we wish to undertake. So sharing a podium with colleagues who are certainly better placed than I am to comment on the EU's external relations, I'll offer you some comments as a political geographer, which is what I am, so thank you for your nod to the importance of maps. And I guess what I'd like to do, and this is coming back to your opening remarks, is to draw our attention to the need to better connect our understandings precisely of domestic politics and external relations. So to connect localized politics and big geopolitics within the EU states, but also in its neighborhood. EU leaders so far have been quite unsuccessful in bringing together these two geographical imaginaries. Although there certainly have been some valiant attempts, and you mentioned the EU's global strategy, this is certainly one such example, because it suggests for the first time quite boldly that there is, or there should be, a connection between the EU's external action and its internal identity, or at least its self-representation as an international actor and its domestic political persona. But beyond such important calls, and unfortunately the global strategy, I think, is still a call, an aspirational document so far. Thus far, in the EU's external engagements in its southern, eastern, and western neighbourhoods, but also beyond, these engagements seem to have contributed, certainly internally, to only sowing disunity and to speeding not further integration, but rather disintegration. I think this is even more worrisome, and this is again coming back to your points, because anti-Europeanist movements and parties both within and outside the EU, have been very able indeed to bring together the domestic and the international imaginaries in a kind of wider politics of resentment, in a wider, could say moral geopolitics that trace, real but also imaginary maps, not of cooperation and integration, but exclusion and at least perceived deprivation. So the Ring of Friends, imagined by Romano Prodi over 15 years ago by now, has in these anti-Europeanist imaginations perhaps not become the kind of ring of fire, as The Economist called it, but certainly it's become a very selective set of barriers, not just physical and legal barriers, such as those that delimit migration, but rather what these forces would argue are barriers to full belonging, to fully being considered part of the European club, or being able to join this club. Now, of course, we could discuss here at length, and this is again coming back to your points, what such belonging should actually entail and require, including perhaps respect of fundamental rights. But I want to keep our attention very much on these geopolitical imaginations and, once more, how they connect the domestic and the international, and how anti-European forces, whether in Poland or Italy, Serbia or Turkey, just to give you some examples, draw on a very ably scripted politics of resentment against the perceived but also very real iniquities of the process of integration and enlargement. And indeed, as you noted, they look to other models of integration because there are competing models of integration and competing integrators. And so such geopolitical visions speak very ably to, once more, the very real losers, not just of kind of wider globalizing processes, but their kind of localized and regionalized varieties. Transformations in which the EU is rightly or wrongly seen as very much having a hand and is somehow blamed for, right? So those who are in fact the losers of these varieties of EU-led transitions, integrations, cooperation agreements, and there are many, see Europe not as a series of concentric circles of potential belonging and integration or of deeper and further Europeanization, but rather as concentric circles of exclusion from Europe's benefits and from Europe's promise as well. And I think that's the important part. The symbolic, I think, is really crucial. And the imaginations of this exclusion from the potential of the European dream, we could say, are not precisely just political and economic. They are very strongly symbolic. And one example that comes to my mind is Poland's recent remembrance law or memory law, and kind of arguing for a form of kind of what scholars have called nostalgic deprivation that has also been evident in politics. I'll cite two more examples, certainly several countries in the Western Balkans, but also in the Ukraine. So, memory politics becomes a very important part of this as well. In this sense, and here I'd like to close because I'd be keen to hear your comments from the discussion. I think, as you noted, the historical experience of imperial disintegration can perhaps be a useful lesson or certainly warning on what happens when a shared geopolitical imaginary fails. Because the dangers are both, again, and will be domestic as well as international.
Thank you very much. Sören.
Thank you, Hannes. When I was preparing and kind of deciding what to say tonight, I shared it with a colleague of mine, and she said, "Oh, don't do it; you'll be eaten alive." But then I think you helped me by saying, let's not be Sunday preachers, and I will try to be realistic, and please don't kill the messenger. And so, ever since 2010. When the mandates of the two commissioners, of European Commissioner for External Relations and European Commissioner for Enlargement, got merged, what we are seeing in terms of the two policies of the EU, on the one hand European neighbourhood policy, on the other hand the enlargement policy, we're seeing these two policies being on a steady, tacit collision course. And I think in the East, the launch of the Eastern Partnership in Prague in 2009 was hailed as a beacon of hope, and rightly so. In the Western Balkans, on the other hand, putting European neighbourhood policy and enlargement under the same umbrella was perceived as yet another nail in the coffin of speedy EU memberships, the membership that these countries were hoping for. And since visa liberalization for the Western Balkans countries in 2009 and 2010, and then since the accession of Croatia in 2013 to EU membership, it has become increasingly clear that this was not just paranoia, that there was a legitimate concern. And then to cement this view from the Western Balkans came the now famous statement of President Juncker from the beginning of his mandate, when he said that there will be no new enlargement for the duration of the mandate of this present Commission. Now, many things changed in the meantime. I'll come back to that in a minute. But I want to say that similar thing happened in the Eastern Partnership countries. After visa liberalization, while some in the EU court Putin, we are still awaiting to see a meaningful follow-up for this visa liberalization that can create, in fact, as well, incentive for reforms amongst the elite of these countries. And visa liberalization has been and is a short-term benefit, really. It's like a glass of water in a desert when you're thirsty. And you're going to drink it, and then you're not going to reminisce about this glass of water, but you will soon want to drink another one, and this is how it is. And I think that the exhaustion of these short-term benefits of EU integration, such as visa liberalization, with the absence of the new incentives, has increased the skepticism towards the EU, at least in the Western Balkans, and has lowered the dividend of reforms for the political elites of these countries. So what happened as a result is basically two processes. On the one hand is democratic backsliding, and on the other hand is allowing other geopolitical powers, and they were prominently mentioned, to come into this space, to strengthen their role in the Eastern Partnership, and to penetrate the area that has been, at least since 2003, when Putin decided to pull out his troops from the Western Balkans, an exclusive EU and Western zone of influence. And I think, here we're talking about the story of two crises, about the world economic crisis, and then about the political crisis in the EU, triggered by the 2015 mass migration that is still ongoing. And what seemed initially in the guise of this migration crisis as a blessing for the Western Balkans, because it did reinvigorate this EU enlargement policy. We saw a dramatic shift in the narrative this February, the EU Western Balkan strategy quickly is turning into a curse, maybe for the Western Balkans, but I'm afraid almost certainly for the Eastern Partnership countries. And this is something that you were talking about when you were talking about the internal political dynamics. I think these two crises raise the stakes of future enlargements in the eyes of the EU political leaders. They perceive their population as imminently hostile to both, on the one hand, deepening of the Eastern Partnership policy, and on the other hand, to a speedy enlargement with the Western Balkans. And this is why I say a tacit collision course. They will never, and I'm talking now to the people from the Eastern Partnership countries, they will never tell you this in your face, but I think this is what they think. And recently I was talking to a highly placed decision maker in a very influential EU member state who told me this, I'm quoting, that the Western Balkans to stand a chance of joining the EU in the next 10 years, the next decade, we have to not invite Ukraine to join, and we have to make it clear to Turkey that they don't have a chance of joining. So this is the current thinking. I don't know if it's correct, and I'm happy to talk about it because we did conduct some qualitative researches who show that maybe the population is not so hostile after all, but we can talk about that later. But this is definitely what motivates the political leaders in their thinking. And I think the deepening of the Eastern Partnership policies, finding a new visa liberalization, and implementing this EU Western Balkan strategy from February 2018, which could bring the front-runner countries, Serbia and Montenegro, close to membership by 2025 or around that date, are mutually exclusive in this political climate. And this is, on the one hand, you can say, yes, it's about the political pragmatism. Let's have certain countries join. That creates hope, momentum for other countries to join. But I want to ask also this question. I'm afraid that we're moving away from enlargement policy as a transformational tool, and that we're moving increasingly towards an interest-based imperative to encircle the EU's borders, coming to the maps again. And I think this is the biggest question, really. How do we understand the very nature of our union here and our values in relation to this? And I truly believe that our values are a cement that keeps us together, and that how we treat the authoritarian leaders within the borders of the EU will finally determine the nature of our future enlargements. If we tolerate Orban and the likes, we might soon wake up in a Europe that resembles very much our past. And it really won't matter if that Europe has 27, 28, 34 or 40 member states. If finally everybody joins, I think we may all try to desperately run away from it. So, I can end on that note, but I would be really happy to be killed as a messenger.
Thank you very much for your optimistic conclusion. I don't know if this applause is for the substance or for the presentation, but at least the messenger will not be killed. Christophe, s'il vous plaît.
Yeah.
Is it not working?
I think this one seems to be dead. I tried.
Okay. Let's change. So.
Well managed. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for the organisers for having me on this panel tonight. I'm a humble lawyer, so you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to make some remarks which are very much inspired by my legal frame of mind, which is another way to say a very narrow frame of mind. I thought I would share with you a couple of remarks around 2 points. First, this notion of unity and disunity in Europe is going to be focused on Europe qua European Union. There are different dynamics of unity and disunity in the European Union, which I would just like to flag up. And then perhaps say a couple of words about the implications they may have on the ongoing enlargement discussions. And then I would like to move on to another layer where we find both unity and disunity, and that's the neighbourhood and Europe more generally. And I would like to do all of this through the prism of the elephant in the room, namely Brexit. With respect to unity and disunity in the European Union itself, there are some elements of unity at play at the moment, and they are very much related to Brexit, paradoxically. First, Brexit means that the biggest beneficiary of opt-outs, namely derogations with respect to the functioning of the EU legal order, is leaving the European Union. So the biggest beneficiary of opt-outs is leaving the EU legal order with all these opt-outs, meaning that derogations in the future might well become much more difficult. Opt-outs from the United Kingdom might be acceptable because it's a big player. Opt-outs from Sweden, well, might be a bit more difficult to justify. So that's one element of more unity, if you like, in connection to Brexit. The second one is connected to the very way the EU 27 have handled Brexit. There is a remarkable show of unity among the 27 at a time where that unity is really quite counterintuitive, given the number of issues which lead to disagreements, and profound disagreements among the member states at the moment. So, second illustration, Brexit does not mean disunity, but rather more unity in the European Union, is pretty much because the 27 have closed ranks. The third one, and I would call it an integration dividend of Brexit, that is that the member states have proven that not only they have shown unity in the context of Brexit, but they have been able to adopt certain measures which, until recently, were simply not possible to adopt. And I'm referring here to the recent decision establishing the permanent structured cooperation in the defence field. But you could find other examples whereby the fact that our British friends leave the European Union somehow psychologically unlock the willingness, if not the potential, to decide on certain issues which were not, which could not have been decided otherwise. So that's my first point. Brexit actually has entailed a level of unity in the EU, which is somewhat paradoxical. For the neighbours, I would say, and the candidate states in particular, that unity might well translate in the EU becoming a little bit more demanding in terms of commitment to subscribe to EU rules and EU principles. The reason why is that because in the very context of Brexit, what we've seen is that the 27 have articulated, if not recalled, certain core principles that underpin the EU legal order. And they will want to make sure that anyone joining the ship is going not to be a troublemaker, but is going to stick to commitments. And that means that the EU will probably become far more scrupulous in ascertaining that the accession conditions are fulfilled. That's so much for unity. There is a lot of disunity appearing in the European Union as well, and I will briefly first mention, forgive me for this strange kind of notion, but a sort of positive disunity, and then I will move to much less positive disunity. The positive disunity is basically the kind of differentiation that is being advocated by some member states at the moment, namely to deepen integration. And I'm referring here, of course, to the ideas that the new French president has put forward in various speeches, namely not so much a differentiation of opt-outs, but a differentiation in the sense of opt-in, i.e. the deepening of the European Union. If it is wished by a certain member state, that deepening should not be held up by those who do not want the EU further to integrate. So, in a way, this disunity could be positive because it could lead to more integration and perhaps ultimately more unity. If you look at the PESCO example, what is striking is that it was supposed to be an enhanced cooperation among very few member states, and it turned out basically to involve 25 member states out of soon 27. The 2 member states not willing to take part, having good constitutional reasons not to be part. So on the whole, whenever there is a potential and willingness to integrate further, be it among only a few member states, at some point of time, the rest of the group will feel that, well, we might as well join in. So this unity, if you like, could have a positive connotation, at least for anyone willing the European Union to go a little bit deeper in its integration. But there is a more toxic disunity, which has been referred to already a number of times, and that's disunity with respect to the fundamentals of the European integration process, the fundamentals of the European Union. The fact that there are increasingly divergent views as to the very premises of the European integration process, and I mean by this the values, is pretty worrying. And the EU will have to tackle that in order to be able to keep a sense of integration. There appears to be more and more moves, signals that the EU is willing to tackle that legally and politically. And I hope that will be successful, because if not, then that toxic disunity might well rock the ship very badly. Now, let me, if I have a couple of minutes left, let me move to unity and disunity in the neighbourhood. And that is very much connected to Brexit as well. What Brexit entails is that differentiation is exported to the neighbourhood, right? The United Kingdom will be a neighbour very different from the other neighbours that the European Union has, right? And so we see with the UK leaving the European Union a sort of diversification of neighbours. And indeed the UK has made the point very clear when it said that it did not want to be approached like a new Norway. It doesn't want the Norwegian or Norway model. So it doesn't want the sort of off-the-shelf kind of arrangement that the EU has. The UK is special and needs to be treated quite exceptionally also as a new neighbour. So that suggests that the EU will have to work out new ways of dealing with this more diversified neighbourhood made of candidate countries, ex-member states, European neighbours who do not want to be member states, and European neighbours that cannot be member state for reason X, Y, and Z. That diversity will require that the European Union come up with instruments which somehow address that diversity at its borders. And I will finish by flagging up a couple of legal provisions which perhaps should be part of the discussion. Since the Lisbon Treaty, a new provision has appeared whereby the EU is mandated to develop a special relationship with neighbouring countries with a view to establishing an area of prosperity and good neighbourliness based on the values of the Union. So the EU has a mandate somehow to maintain a degree of unity across Europe, in the neighbourhood as well, in a sense of trying to connect the neighbours, whether they're candidates, whether they're ex-member states, whether they can or cannot be part or do not want to be part of the Union. The EU has a mandate to connect with those states with a view to at least sharing a sense of unity around the values of the EU, which are values beyond the EU itself. So I will finish on that note by saying that the EU has somewhat to do to try and maintain a sense of unity well beyond the European Union, but unity across Europe based on some shared values, which somehow need to be articulated, but certainly better ensured that they are at the moment.
Thank you very much. Now, Fernando, the Austrians always look to the south, to Italy, for hope, for sun, for optimism, looking into the future. Please, give us
what's the challenge. First of all, let me thank the Austria-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe and the other organizer of this conference for the invitation. I'm very pleased and honored to be here tonight and tomorrow. Maybe since the main subject of the conference is the Eastern Partnership, the prospects and the future of this, together with the prospects of the Western Balkans, I'd like to spend a few words to explain why we speak or we talk about an enlargement fatigue and we also speak of an Eastern Partnership fatigue. And there are many reasons to explain this. There is nothing new in what I would be saying, but I think it's useful to remind the audience that the European Union is in the middle of a very, very deep and serious crisis. It has been also labeled as an existential crisis, particularly in my country, for reasons that I will say a few words on in a moment. The economic and financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and then again in 2011, 2012 hit in a dramatic manner the Union and the Eurozone in particular. And it also showed and demonstrated all the weaknesses and the inadequacies of the governance of our common currencies, which had been constructed in a situation where no crisis was anticipated, and we were forced to face a crisis of that dimension without any special means available to face the crisis and to avoid the collapse of the euro. We were successful, yes, to a certain extent. We avoided the worst-case scenario. We avoided the collapse of the euro. But the consequences of the crisis have been very tough on our people, on our citizens, and in particular in some countries of the Eurozone. I'm referring, of course, in particular to my country. Now the recovery is there. Growth is back again. Most of the Eurozone countries are doing much better than years ago. Some are not as performing as others. But the governance of the Eurozone still needs to be completed, and this is a tremendous challenge, in particular for the members of the Eurozone. We have a banking union which is halfway constructed, it needs to be completed, and we have still a number of measures that need to be hopefully adopted and implemented to reinforce the governance of our common currency. This is probably one of the main challenges Europe has to face in the near future in a situation where the political context is not particularly favorable. This I have to be very honest. Then came the migratory flows crisis, 2014, 2015. Whether or not it was an emergency, whether or not it was a real crisis, it's not particularly important. It was perceived as such. It was perceived as such by most countries, and by in particular the countries that were more exposed than others to the impact of migratory flows. And the answer, the response by the Union, has also been perceived as weak, insufficient, and we have to be very honest. So we collectively were able to develop some successful policies when it comes to what I would define the external component of a common migratory policies, which means relations with countries of origin and transit. We were able as a union to make available to these countries money and assistance in exchange for their cooperation in managing these flows. Great success with Turkey, much less success with Libya so far. But when it comes to the domestic component of these migratory policies, it was a total failure. There was no solidarity whatsoever for countries that were more exposed than others. And this is something which has been resented quite strongly, particularly in the countries which were more exposed than others. And it has also been instrumentalized by political forces with enormous dividends when it comes to electoral results, as we have seen in Italy, by the way. And then there have been two accidents de parcours. I would say Brexit is certainly one, which had also an enormous impact. And it showed for the first time that the participation in the Union is not an irreversible process. So far we have increased the number of members in an exponential manner. For the first time there was one member which decided to leave the Union. Quite a trauma for the others and for the Union. By the way, I agree with the last speaker that we were able to show an incredible unity in dealing with Brexit so far, thanks to many factors. I won't develop this, but this has been a success. And I hope that we will be able to reach the final stage with a success, with an agreement with the UK, of course. Then came also the elections of Trump in the United States. Nobody mentioned this factor, but this has also been a highly destabilizing factor for the Union. For the first time in Washington, in the history of the European communities and the European Union, we have a president which is clearly against the European project and does not hide his antagonism, his reluctance even to consider the Union as its interlocutor. This is an enormous challenge, not to mention all the policies that Trump has implemented, which also imply tremendous challenges for the European Union. Take, for instance, the protectionist measures that have been adopted or threatened by Trump. Take, for instance, the decision to withdraw from the agreement on climate. Take, for instance, the latest decision to probably give up or denounce the agreement on intermediate nuclear forces, which may become a major challenge, at least for some European countries. All these and other factors, of course, have determined an exponential growth of political forces in most European countries. Fortunately enough, not in all European countries, but in most European countries. There are clearly, I would say, Eurosceptic, Europhobic. It differs to the, you have enormous varieties of possible attitude, but certainly those political forces are not Euro-enthusiastic, they're not Euro-supporters, and they are not actually playing in favor of a stronger, more united Europe. Is it a surprise that in such a situation enlargement is proceeding slowly with little progresses? No, I don't think it is a surprise. We have to be very honest. And I don't think it is a surprise that also the Eastern Partnership is progressing very slowly. And we have to be pragmatic and realistic, as I think you mentioned in your introductory statement. This does not mean that we don't have to pursue the enlargement. We committed ourselves to the European perspective for the countries of the Western Balkans. I remember back in Thessaloniki, 2003, at the highest political level, we undertook a very solemn political commitment to open the door of Europe to the countries of the Western Balkans. And so far, progresses have been rather modest, we have to be aware. In some cases, for responsibilities that are responsibilities of the countries of the region, but also because of the lack of political determination and political will on the side of the European Union. And we have to go ahead. I mean, it's in our interest to provide the region with stability, economic development, and safeguards for democracies and the rule of law. This is in our interest. I'm speaking as an Italian. The Balkans are our neighbors. They are a few kilometers from the coast, so we have a very strong interest in pursuing these policies. But in the awareness that we could not produce miracles in the short run. We cannot produce miracles. So there is a need for a lot of patience, goodwill, good determination. But at least in the case of the Western Balkans, we have the strong incentive of the prospect of accession, which you don't have, actually, and we have to be very honest, we don't have in the case of the countries of the Eastern Partnership, which makes the case much more difficult with those countries than with the countries of the Western Balkans. I remember that I was in Brussels as permanent representative when the strategy of the Eastern Partnership was launched in 2009. By the way, it was launched in the middle of the worst crisis ever happened to the European Union. So it was a real success that despite the economic and financial crisis, our leaders were able to agree on this strategy. But we, in a very short run, realized that we had to include in that strategy an element of differentiation which was not clearly stated at the beginning of the strategy. Now things are emerging with a lot more clarity. We know what countries of the region expect from the European Union. We know that what the European Union can realistically provide to the countries of those regions. But we also know that stability, economic development, welfare and well-being for the population, support for democracies and for the rule of law are also an interest of the European Union. We need an area of stability in our eastern borders. We need an area of stability, knowing that those countries are not only our neighbors, they are also the neighbors of Russia. And in that respect, I think we made some mistakes. We should also recognize this. We think that whatever will have to be implemented in that direction, we will have to take into account that those countries are also the neighbors of Russia. I know what Russia thinks about that area. I'm not questioning. I don't want to enter into a polemic on that, but I think that we have to take into account this reality, which is something with which we have to live with. Last word on Russia, since you provoked me. Yes, you're right. I mean, there are political forces, in particular, one of the two parties which support the Italian government these days is very much pro-Russian and does not hide this attitude. Mr. Salvini went to Moscow for a private meeting, private, quote unquote, and he strongly advocated the abrogation of sanctions for Russia. But he knows very well, he's too smart to ignore that he cannot alone, Italy cannot abrogate, suspend, diminish sanctions against Russia. It could stimulate a reflection on within and among our partners on the wisdom of such a move. I think that he would not succeed because the prevailing mood is not in that direction. But to understand why there is this strong feeling on Russia, in particular in one of the two parties, you have to realize that there are very strong economic interests. Not only because Russia provides us with the probably most important quota of imports of gas, 36% I think of gas imported from outside comes from Russia. But also because there is a strong connection of economic interest at all levels. Big companies, the small and medium enterprises, trade, investment, they are there since the period of the Soviet Union, and they have continued steadily, probably have increased, and those economic sectors have suffered, not extraordinary, but have suffered to a certain extent because of the sanctions. And this explains why in Italy it is rewarding in terms of electoral consensus to speak against sanctions in Russia. But I'm not particularly worried that there will be any special move by the government on that respect. Thank you. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think it was very interesting. Maybe before we go to the audience, one question to you. If you would run for President of the European Commission, or you would be already elected as President, what is your major signal, your major message you would give? I mean, anyway, we need a woman as a President of the Commission, and if it's not Madame Merkel, it's you, Lisa. So what would your message be? What direction, what challenge you would take up mostly, especially concerning our subject here? Just very brief, 1-2 minutes.
I'll take this. I think I would take the politics of resentment that we've been talking about very seriously, which I think, recognizing the various feelings of exclusion, inequality, which are, very real and have been instrumentalized only by, whether we want to call them populist forces or otherwise. And I think, you were mentioning the elections in Hesse, and I think those are a very important sign. So, whether we can somehow understand that, because it is fundamentally also tied to what Europe does in its neighborhoods and not only. So that would certainly be it.
And what would you do? Would you go into a dialogue, or what? How could you deal with that?
I would say that, addressing both the political, economic, and the symbolic would be very important, which has been, certainly, you mentioned Trump, and I was trying not to use the T word tonight, as also an American citizen, among other things, because it fills me with horror, but I think the failure, certainly, of the Democratic Party in the United States has been, not to recognize kind of the symbolic politics of resentment that have built up, not just political, economic ones as well.
That's a tough one, especially for a lawyer. Thinking aloud, I would certainly invest a lot of political capital to foster more social cohesion across Europe, with something around the whole notion of European citizenship, which essentially is at the moment just about free movement, the ability of citizens just to move from one country to the other. I think there's much more positive spin that could be created around the notion of European citizenship and free movement by adding perhaps a European level of support to accompany free movement. Certainly not remove free movement from the treaties. I think this is absolutely essential for the European integration process. But there must be more positive accompanying policies around free movement to make it really work. But in addition to this, I think the European Union will not survive without a really deeply integrated foreign policy. We cannot continue to let the member state go in all sorts of directions with their own foreign policy, having very little loyalty, including in relation to agreed common approaches. What has happened in Moscow over the last few days is just unbelievable. We cannot have a European Union that is able to continue to have so many integrated policies internally, thinking that the rest of the world does not matter. If we want to maintain what has maintained this continent in peace for the last few decades, we need an active foreign policy to defend that, to defend the interest of the European Union. And that might mean institutionally accepting that in some situations a member state will have to give way in its own foreign policy interests to the benefit of the common good, which is the common good of Europe at large, actually. So these two directions.
So you are a good lawyer, Fernando?
Yes, yes, of course. I agree with the answer. The first lady with the very difficult name to pronounce. That the first thing that needs to be done is to address the deep root causes of the disaffection towards the European Union. The only problem is that the causes of disaffection are not always the same in different countries. So there is a big problem of trying to find common answers to challenges that may be different and have a lot to do with sensitivities of national and local constituencies, but of course more efforts to stimulate growth. I think that would be something that everybody would agree. More efforts to increase social cohesion and inclusion. I think that this is also something on which it would be hard to disagree. And second element, I think that I would try to do my best, if I was the President of the Commission, to demonstrate with facts, with deeds, that without the Union we would be much worse off. And in that respect, I think that the testimony of the countries that wish to accede to the Union would be very appreciable. We should ask the citizens in the Western Balkans or in the Eastern partnership countries to tell us why they are so eager to join this club, whilst our public opinions are so reluctant to remain in the club. There are many examples that can can be developed in that respect. But it's not difficult in most cases to communicate those things in a straightforward manner, in a direct manner that is able to hit the hearts and minds of all the citizens. And third things that I would try to do is to avoid useless initiatives or measures. Recently I learned of the entry into force of a directive, I had forgotten that directive, which would impose the change of the labels in the gas station of our carburanti, come si dice?
Pumping station?
Petrol
station.
Petrol station, yeah. So in a few months' time, this is the case in Italy, the easy label, which means green fuel, diesel, and so on, would disappear to leave the room and space for something that would be completely ununderstandable to the ordinary citizen. This is the typical. There could be very good reasons. I'm not arguing for the reasons. The technicians would tell me why this has been adopted. But in practical terms, this is the typical measures, the typical initiative by the European Union which provokes this affection in consumers and citizens. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, if I were to be the president of the European Commission, three things really. First of all, I will not accept being a president of the European Commission in a political majority that Orban Spidis is in, and if Orban Spidis votes for me, I will not be in that position. That's the first thing. And I'm saying that with a very topical upcoming vote in the primaries. And the second thing is, as a Serb and as an Italian, I would definitely send a clear message to the Western Balkans countries that if they do not fulfill the rule of law criteria, and I'm also a lawyer, so I'm saying in that particular sense, they would never join. And that's in the interests of the citizens of these countries, and I think increasingly so there is this feeling, you know. So, and finally, the third thing is, I would draw a clear line where the European Monroe Doctrine would apply. And in that sense, I'm just repeating what you're saying, that we have to be united in our foreign policy. And this is not about enemies, this is about being respected in the world. And in that sense, whether that line is drawn in the Western Balkans, whether it would encompass Moldova, whether it will encompass the association countries, Moldova, Ukraine, I don't know. I mean, you have to be realistic and see where you can have a consensus. But I think, you know, what we do with enlargement is a clear litmus test for the EU if it wants to pretend to be a global actor. So I think, first, gain respect from others. And that's what I would do, yes.
Okay, it's been an interesting discussion between you two on respecting Russia as a neighbor, and then on the other hand have some sort of a Monroe doctrine. But you will have to find some European politicians at least to have that doctrine called upon. Now we have some minutes time for some questions, short remarks, not second, yes. The young man there. Yeah, but
Thank you very much. My name is Tobias Schumacher. I'm a eminent professor and shareholder of the European Neighbour Policy Chair at the College of Europe in Anatolia. I would like to thank the five of you, in fact, including you, Mr. Svoboda, for your introductory remarks, for very thought-provoking and I think very cogent and pertinent remarks. I would like to, very briefly, as we were just reminded, start with a comment of a more general nature and then two questions, one of which is addressed to you, Serjan, and the other to you, Christoph. I couldn't help but notice that in particular in the keynote speeches, presentations that were given, the discourse revolved very much around the notion that the European Union as such is a rules-based system, if not to say actor. It reminds me a little bit of the debate that we in the European studies have on the European Union being an ideal power. An ideal power that uses meta-representations such as being postmodern, being post-sovereign, being a role model, being de facto a normative power, through which, in fact, it creates its own identity, reinforces its own identity, and thereby also, in a sense, creates the identity of the others, which all too often, either in the Western Balkans or in the Eastern or Southern neighborhood, characterized as being inferior, imperfect, unstable, and you name it. While de facto, and you alluded to that in your introductory remarks, Mr. Swoboda, while de facto, in the global strategy, for example, which focuses on principled pragmatism, something that doesn't really go together, by the way, the European Union de facto focuses very strongly and almost exclusively on promoting stabilization, they call it resilience nowadays, which at the end of the day is nothing else but buying the services or buying into the services of the mafia bosses who have created a demand for these very services, and those mafia bosses being autocratic leaders. The European Union itself, de facto, and again you alluded to this in your introductory remarks, is now faced with a situation where member states are not just only faced with the threat of the fragility, right, but in fact where we are faced with a situation where member states themselves no longer comply with the very rules and norms that the European Union stands for. So in other words, I wonder whether in fact it is still realistic to speak of the European Union as a norms and rules-based actor. My question to Christophe, we were encouraged at the beginning that Europe needs a new agenda, a step-by-step approach vis-à-vis the neighborhood. I wonder actually to what extent that is realistic, given that the mood has changed entirely in Brussels, and you mentioned that as well. There is no more appetite these days to give the neighbors whatever incentives, unless the neighbors eventually really take their homework seriously, or do take them seriously, and implement, and not just approximate with EU law. My question to you, Serjan, you mentioned the role of external powers in the neighborhood, in the Western Balkans. You mentioned Russia. Russia was mentioned on various occasions. And all too often it seems to me as if Russia in particular is being portrayed as being intrusive, as acting unlawfully, which I think we can all agree on. But all too often what is neglected is, in fact, whether societies in some of the countries we are talking about, be they in the East, be they in the Western Balkans, do in fact demand to some extent greater Russian involvement. In other words, is there not all too often, take Serbia for example, the fertile ground where in fact such Russian engagement is very well received?
Thank you very much. Another question? Yeah, here.
I have two questions for Mr. Ferrucci.
Wait a minute.
I have two questions for Mr. Ferrucci. The first question is, you said that Mr. Trump has a quite negative attitude towards Europe. Do you have any idea how to react against this attitude of Trump? My second question is, you have said that all those countries who have Russia as neighbor, that this neighborhood of Russia should be taken into consideration. In blunt terms, do you say that all those countries which have Russia as neighbor should not become members of the European Union?
So, clear questions? Anything? Yes, we have somebody here.
Thank you. Nice agency does also. Following up on what was just said, I wanted to ask what is the situation we are heard about from the statement from our guest in Brussels about the fact that we would be trading off the integration of Western Balkans and leave aside Ukraine However, what kind of message is this sending to a country which has been resisting almost blown Russian aggression for the past 5 years? And where would the new border be? Because, as you know, in Russia, what is being discussed since Russia made clear its intentions to destabilize Ukraine to prevent it from joining the EU and NATO, they could see easily Ukraine cut in two between Donbas, Larich, Novorossiya, which would be totally vassal or appendage of Russia, and then what would be left of Ukraine and Western Ukraine, barely trying to catch the train of European integration. Is this what we want for the continent, and don't you think it would be creating more problems in the future?
No. Yes, please, here.
Thank you. There's one specific dimension of the European integration process that is the issue of identity. We have moved from the pluri-identity society of the empires to the creation of the single identity nation state, which led to the Second World War. And then we moved back to integration. But the issue of the pluri-identity personality and the pluri-identity society has not been really addressed on the European scale. The Council of Europe organized once, that's almost 30 years ago, in Paris, a conference on this issue of what do we do with the plurality of identities. In the intermission, just a footnote, I'm sorry, the French head of delegation stormed up to the presidency and said, that's all nonsense. The nation state is and will remain the cornerstone of Europe. Well, the president said, well, look at Paris. 40% of Parisians aren't even born in France. What is that? But on the European level, we have not launched yet a program of what now is called societal development. This is the internalization of otherness into one's own identity. Curiously enough, in Carinthia, the Slovenes there, they have a product that's beautiful. It says, as many languages you speak, as many times you are a human being. Because that's in fact true. And one incredible asset for the future of Europe is that it has a society that is able to bear one the more identity, and that's European.
Thank you. It could be a final word, but we still have. So I have still one question there from the lady, or these two questions, and we have to go back. Yes, please.
Good evening. I'm a student here at the
Yes.
Diplomatic Academy. My question actually will be directed at Mr. Perotti and Mr. Zvic. I'm currently writing an article for the Polemics magazine about the complexity and dysfunctionality of Bosnian political system and constitution, Bosnia and Herzegovina. And I've talked to a lot of law professors and I've interviewed a lot of people, and almost all of them, actually virtually all of them, agree that the constitution works as a peace agreement, because it is a part of the peace agreement, but as a constitution, that it does not and will never work. So my question is how we can expect from a country, how European community can expect from a country with such a dysfunctional system and constitution to make progress in fulfilling the conditions to join the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And this gentleman.
Thank you very much for all your inputs to this discussion. My name is Philip Brugner, and I'm representing the Young European Ambassadors Network. And it's a network which is especially established to connect the youth between the EU member states and the Eastern Partnership countries, whereas also the further dimension of EU member states towards the Western Balkans could be targeted. So my point is, and my note goes also into this direction of shedding more light maybe on the dimension of youth, because the youth is a generation which will gain more power in the years to come. So I'm referring also to what was said on the panel of maybe it needs more time to find the ways of cooperation with partners. Maybe it's a question of time, maybe it's a question of the change of generations. And highlighting this idea, I see a lot of potential among young representatives of these countries. We are now a network of 500 people. Our application was 4 times as high as the number of young people in this network. I'm now for the 3rd year in this network, so we are traveling to the region from the EU to the Eastern Partnership countries. We are also meeting in the EU countries. And our idea is to be not a political project, because taking out pressure, as Mr. Fassler mentioned in his introductory remarks, is maybe a new way of how to create also a new form of ownership with the countries. And taking out political pressure can open up new opportunities for finding new mechanisms for dialogue. And our project is an opportunity-based project. We are calling ourselves a non-political project. So I wanted to stress this factor of presenting the EU also as the project which offers opportunities to these countries, rather than focusing on the pragmatic political dimension. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have now some questions, and now we come to the answers. Do you want to start? We go this way, maybe?
Yes, I can start. Maybe first to answer to the question I can see you now from the lady from Poland. That's definitely not what I was suggesting. I was just saying that this is really the political reality that you never hear openly, but this is what some, let's say, key member states' predominant thinking is. And on the Ukraine's borders, I think they are internationally recognized as they are. We were talking about the sanctions. They are related to this particular issue, so I think there is no doubt about that in my mind, if you're asking me personally. So that's just to be clear. And the second question, yes, it was about Bosnia. And look, I mean, I think the problems that Bosnia has are in some ways specific, but in some ways also not. We shouldn't be always trying to find the excuse almost in the constitutional structure. Look at what's happening when you look at the protests about the murder of David Dragicevic, and the same protests in the Federation for murder of another young man that were killed in complete impunity. This united people across the entities. This already happened a couple of years ago in the protests against anti-corruption. I think you can make some tangible progress if there is a political will in the rule of law field, even if, let's say, you do not address the most kind of poignant issues in the constitutional setting. It's possible. We shouldn't be using it as an excuse, and that can come along the way. That means that Bosnia could start the accession negotiations if they would fulfill some basic criteria, and if the EU would be a bit less stringent in opening these negotiations. I'm not talking about closing. And yes, just a small remark on shedding more light on the youth. I don't know if you heard about the Berlin process, and I think the only tangible achievement of this Berlin process up till now is the creation of the Youth Cooperation Office and Network that has a seat in Tirana and that has a president from Serbia. So I think this is a very positive development. If I would look at somewhere to cooperate, if you're not already doing it, I would try to contact these people. And finally, a reply to Professor Schumacher, to Tobias. Look, I mean, is Russia fertile ground in the Western Balkans, and in Serbia in particular? I can just tell you an anecdote. So a couple of months ago, I was in the elevator of a socialist high-rise building in Belgrade when I was born, And I met my neighbor, and he loves Russia, he loves Putin. He doesn't even know the names of the EU leaders, apart from Angela Merkel maybe. But you know, he wants his son to live and work in Germany. And he always asks me about how is Italy, how is Belgium. And you know, once I teasingly asked him, so, but why don't you want your son to go and study in Russia, in Moscow, in St. Petersburg? And you know what he told me? He told me, you must be mad. So I think, and I'm telling you this anecdote because this anecdote is not only an anecdote, it reflects the opinion polls. So you have opinion polls which show that yes, when you ask people about their feelings towards Russia, and this is normally phrased like this, towards Russia, they're generally positive, and mine will be positive as well. But when you ask them, you don't really go deeply into that, what does that mean? And then when you ask them, where would you like where would you like to live, and where would you like your children to live in? It's normally Germany or some Scandinavian countries. And what is most appreciated about the EU is the rule of law and kind of the predictability of life in these countries. So, yeah.
Thank you. If they can't reach Germany, they stay in Austria.
Exactly, yes.
Thank you. But on Trump and the European Union, I think that so far the European Union has reacted quite well and positively. In a sense, as Brexit, also Trump has functioned as a factor of unification, incredibly so. Look at the reaction to the protectionist measures. Immediately the European Union threatened the imposition of similar sanctions on the EU. I'm speaking of restriction on imports of steel and aluminium from Europe to the US. So far the measures by the US is suspended. They are looking into the imports of cars, which would actually affect, in particular, Germany. We are able and capable and willing to retaliate if necessary. But of course the idea is not as much as to provoke a trade war with the US, but to bring Trump and his administration to the negotiating table. The case of NAFTA is a telling story. They have threatened to disrupt NAFTA, but just only to obtain minor improvements in the existing agreements. So there is a lot of theater in Trump's policy, and we also have to take into account that the main targets of this trade policy is China, much more than the European Union. We have been able to stick to our commitments on climate. We have been able to maintain our position, for instance, on the Iranian nuclear deal. I hope that we will be able to speak with one voice. This is going to be a bit more complicated on the question of the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces. But altogether, I am encouraged by the reaction of the European Union to Trump's. And I'm also optimistic that in the longer run, we will also be able to develop a more cooperative relation. Now, on the countries of Eastern Partnership, their prospect of accession to the European Union, I have to be very frank and realistic. This is not for tomorrow, and it's not for the day after tomorrow. It's not for the medium term. Not because of Russia, but because we will not be able to digest such an enlargement. So I think that, and to maintain an optimistic tone in that respect, I think that hopefully and possibly an answer would be along the way that Professor Lilian described, towards more differentiation in the way the European Union will proceed also in the future. More differentiated integration would allow some room for maneuver to integrate different categories of neighbors. The UK will become a very special case of neighbor. The countries of the Eastern Partnership are also a very special case of neighbors. So I hope that in that respect, differentiation may provide a positive answer to the question of how to integrate those countries into the European structures. Finally, a word on the youth. I think what you mentioned is particularly important. There is a desperate need to involve the youngest, the students, not only the students, in a sort of mobilization in support of Europe. There is a feeling and an impression that the younger generation have lost track of the actual purpose of the integration process for generational reasons. I mean, they have probably forgotten the very deep-rooted causes of this process. And if the most motivated young people will act to mobilize their colleagues in their generation, I think this is can only be very, very positive. There is a desperate need, including in my country, to mobilize young on European subject. Thank you.
Thank you. Christoph?
Thank you, Tobias, for your question. I'll be brief in saying basically that I agree with you that for the EU to give lessons to the rest of the world, it has to be impeccable. It cannot give lessons to the candidate states requiring that they meet all sorts of criteria with respect to the rule of law, if within the European Union there are some member states who are increasingly difficult players when it comes to those fundamental values. So in order to exercise that kind of to have that kind of attitude of a normative power, it has to meet its own the values that it reaches. But I would say that things are moving in that direction. As paradoxical as it may sound, there is a realization that indeed the double standard critique has been a major impediment to the credibility of the EU's discourse regionally and globally. And I think what we're witnessing at the moment in terms of EU institutions trying to tackle the disrespect of EU values, but it's not only the EU institutions. We see national courts at the moment. I don't know whether you're following the fact that some national courts are now doubting as to whether they will cooperate with the judiciary in the countries that we're talking about. So things are happening. So there is a realization that the EU cannot continue just to ignore this double standard critique. It has to have its house in order, and not only to continue to be a normative power vis-à-vis the candidates and vis-à-vis the neighbours. It has to have its house in order to be able to continue to operate properly. I just wanted to flag up 2 points, perhaps, for this discussion, and that is that there is another major development, which is that Brexit brings to light the notion that being part of the European integration process is no longer solely dependent on membership. Of course, it was already there. I mean, a country like Norway, where I live, is a full player in the European integration process short of membership. It's fully integrated in the internal market. It's part of Schengen. In many respects, living in Norway and traveling within the European Economic Area is easier than traveling from Brussels to the United Kingdom, even if the United Kingdom is still a member state. So what I'm saying is that there is now more and more this realization that being part of the European integration process does not mean that you have to be a member. There are many other ways to be part of the European integration process than being a member. And that's something that the EU and its member states will have to work on, notably to be able to develop a credible European neighbourhood policy or Eastern Partnership worth of its name, without closing the door altogether. It would be unconstitutional for the European Union to close the door to a country like Ukraine if, in a few years' time, Ukraine meets the Copenhagen criteria. Well, we'll see whether that's possible. But if the Ukraine was to be able to meet the Copenhagen criteria, it would be very difficult for the European Union simply to just ignore it. So I think the EU simply cannot close the door. It would be a renunciation of the very basis of its existence.
So that is the reason why many countries or politicians hope that Ukraine will not fulfill the criteria in order to avoid that decision. But please, Luisa.
So I'll be very brief, and actually what I'll do is I'll start with the first question from Tobias and finish with the last question, try to kind of weave it all together, because I think what you said about the fact that Europe's geopolitical vision is no longer convincing or contradictory, hypocritical, that is a very real problem. And actually I can speak from having just spent time with those who hopefully will be Europe's future generation of thinkers, leaders, so students at the College of Europe, where I've been teaching a course on geopolitics for the past 5 years. So in some ways, let's say, an audience that is already of kind of self-convinced Europeans. And yet, even those students, and now I've had a chance to observe 5 generations of them, including students, many students from countries of the Eastern Partnership, are very doubtful and indeed quite depressed at the lack of a strong geopolitical vision for Europe. And I think this is a problem. And this, in a sense, comes also to your question about identity and about the need to build a strong European identity. And that, to my mind, as I've already said, has largely failed. And coming back to your question of the role of youth, I think it's curious that we even have to frame it in those ways, as though youth were some kind of special category in having voice in European politics. Let's say the question of having voice in Europe is not only geographic, but it's also demographic. And the feeling of being excluded from having a say in the European project and what it is, but especially what it will be. I think that's a crucial question that needs to be answered. I mean, if we are to weave this common identity and have a strong vision to go forward. So thank you for bringing that up.
So thank you very much. Thank you for the panel, for your contribution. Thank you for the discussant. I think and this is the message also to you, to the next and final speaker, what we discussed here was you can be very open and frank, and still you cannot lose or shouldn't lose the sight of a bigger Europe. But on the other hand, you should not take it up again, Sunday preacher, and say everything is okay. No, many things are not okay inside also the European Union. But we cannot stop here and should not stop here. If you say it constitutionally, because European countries, per se, can ask for membership. But the second point, of course, is, and I think it should be also very clear, we should be very honest and very clear also to the enemies of Europe. You mentioned that. I always said we should not have a Europe Day, a non-Europe Day. We should one day where everybody has controls at the borders, has different currencies, has no minimum standards, social standards, no minimum environmental standards. What the people would say if we would go back. But we leave the field to the anti-Europeans, so to say, that they always can explain and can complain about the European Union, but they never say what they want to scrap. With the exception of what you mentioned, I fully agree. Also we in the European Parliament, when I was still there, sometimes, and Rebecca is here, sometimes we have decisions where I ask, is it really necessary to have that kind of regulation? Cannot it come more from the member states and then do it and not the other way around? So there are issues, but I think in general, if you look to the vast majority of progress we had, most of the people, even of the right-wing or nationalistic people, would not like to lose these rights and to use these possibilities, but we have to say it very strongly. And the last point on the youth, some of the organizations who organize it today, including the French Austrian Center, and including my institute and the Arena Institute, will have a meeting on the 5th and 6th of November with the youth, with the younger generation. Maybe we can also have a contact with you directly from the region, and we want also to use them as some sort of ambassadors for the region to say their view about their country. Because what you said is not the main line of what Serbian politicians say. And very often European politicians hear what Serb or Bosnia-Herzegovina politicians say, and it's not what the youth and the younger generation think of their countries, because they want to overcome all these identity policies which restrict oneself to one identity. you are a Republika Srpska identity. No, there are many, everybody has many identities, and Europe is a place where you can develop all these identities. So thank you again for your contributions, and then I hand over here, and then finally to you.
Topic from different interesting angles with us. Thank you to the panel and thank you as well to the audience. Now I have the honor to introduce Ms. Morari, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and European Integration from the Republic of Moldova, who made all the way from Chisinau to Vienna to be with us tonight. Ms. Morari, the floor is yours.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm very pleased to be and very honored to be here today. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very humbled to speak after such a panel and such key speakers, and I very value the open and frank and at the same time motivational, and I very much believe as better we understand, the better also we can shape and we can also try in a way to make things together. I'm double in a way emotional to be here today after having my first course in European integration 15 years ago here in the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. And I very lively remember the discussions and debate we had in the group that time, and some of the questions very relevant even now. And I will try also to focus on the perspective from the region, how it's in the agenda, but maybe some elements to comment on what already been said during the presentation, the speeches already. And we always start, since the Republic of Moldova started its way on the European integration, as we call it back home, always we heard about crisis in European Union. It always not a good time for us, but nevertheless things happened. And I remember here the quote of the Steve Jobs saying that you can connect the dots only looking backward, never looking forward. And I think it's very important also to look and to make in a way understanding of some of the elements that contributed to reality we're now, and also this type of reflection and discussions. Coming from the region and trying in a way to put into perspective the topic of unity and disunity, diversity, and also the tools and instruments for the cooperation, I'll try to go through the Eastern Partnership, because this is the policy, this is the instruments that we have, and this is the shoes we are now. And also, it's where we see how this unity and disunity in practice. And I think also can be useful being the last speaker, to have a bridge from tomorrow's discussion on having this Eastern Partnership Reflection Forum. And I think it's a very good timing to really have it now, especially the October was the month of Eastern Partnership. I would say in the beginning of the month was the senior official meeting of Eastern Partnership. In the middle of the month it was a ministerial meeting where I tried to look on the 20 deliverables by 2020, where we are 1 year after the deliverables have been agreed at the summit of the Eastern Partnership in November last year. And also to see where is the need of the commitment, and also how to plan to see the next decade ahead. As Commissioner Hahn always says, 2020 is around the corner. And it's very important also to reflect and to see how and in which way realistically we can take on board and exactly know what to do. I will start with the multilateral side of the Eastern Partnership. And here I think is the first element of differentiation, or different in a way starting positions for the implementation of all the Eastern partners. Also in doing the bilateral, but also implementing the 20 deliverables by 2020. And I think it's this process is a clear reflection of the differentiated principles. And also it's very important to take into account every single effort done by every single country. And I very much believe that in the future this is the only way of really keeping this differentiated approach and also to keep the differentiated pace by and also to keep it flexible in order to accommodate the different aspirations and ambitions of different partners, but at the same time to find a way to keep it in a way together. And I very much resonate with what was mentioned about the lessons learned from the Brexit. Even there have been several studies also looking at different models, how Brexit, what can take on board, and also examining our association agreements. We also, the countries from the Eastern Partnership, are very closely following the process and also trying to understand what's going to be the model and agreement that will be negotiated between EU and UK, and what can be some elements of inspiration for us. And also I very much believe in this like not medium, like not even short, medium, but very in a way long-term perspective of this process for the Eastern Partnership. I think it's very important also in this multilateral perspective to look on these practical elements, what can put us like to plant different seeds of reversibility. Or I very much believe in this philosophy that you do small changes in DNA, the entire DNA changes. And it's very much important like to find what are these small elements into this process. Like the recent, in a way, element of revising the architecture of the Eastern Partnership, it's a very small and minor step, but also it kind of contributes like to have a very small and very visible impact on the efficiency of this, in a way, platform. And it's just in a couple of months. And this is why I'm very much looking forward also for the discussion tomorrow. What could be the additional elements that we could also bring for this short and medium term in order to be more practical and more pragmatic on that side. On the bilateral side, like if to look on these practical approaches of the EU cooperation and integration, as also how is the title of the discussion today, for the Republic of Moldova for the time being is the association agreement. This is the tool, and this is the platform, the instrument we have. And as you mentioned that the visa liberalization and the association agreement was a glass of water in the desert, maybe association agreement it's a bucket of water, but it has no taste of water. And this is maybe difficult to explain, but this is in a way how it's perceived of so in a way heavy content that it has, and responsibility and engagement. We are very committed to further work on the association agreement. We are already on the 4th year of implementation. We already can talk about some results, some of the processes, some where we are, but still the list of homework is very huge ahead of us. Even despite all the domestic challenges and like also some external challenges too, we kind of trying to work and also to deliver with the line institutions on all the key commitments that we have. Regarding some concrete results, I would like to refer to like economic side, and especially on the deep and comprehensive free trade area. Also discussing about the values that was a lot discussed during the discussion. When we entered into the discussions and negotiations on the DCFTA, one of the key elements that was highlighted in all the surveys was the good quality back home. It was not the trade with EU, not any other like very important elements for developing and strengthening the economy, but was about the values and the quality and having European standards back home. And already now, after 4 years, we can talk about that 2/3 of our economy, about our trade, goes to EU. And it gives a lot of benefits to the businesses, to the producers, and has even more potential that we're now working on, especially if fulfilling all the necessary standards of animal origin foods in order like to have in a way even more impact. The DCFTA and this component, it plays a very important role also for the confidence building measures, like the Transnistrian region companies, also more than 60-65% also do export with EU. And also the association agreement, the visa liberalization, like having this inclusive approach, it really helped to motivate and to contribute to the reintegration of the country. Just to give you a data, like before 2014, we had around 30,000 of biometric passports issued in the Transnistrian region, and now we have around 150,000 biometric passports issued in the Transnistrian region. Even we had so many, in a way, facilitation tools before, nothing really resonated with the power of visa liberalization. Talking, coming back to the economic sector, I would like to highlight here the first experience of way of cooperation between the three countries implementing the association agreements and the DCFTA, Georgia, Moldova, and Ukraine. We had in this September for the first time the first meeting, the platform, organized by Commissioner Malmström, and we really think that this is very useful. Even we're very committed to the principle of inclusiveness. It's very important to have additional platform where we can, the countries that we have additional commitments, where we are having certain, in a way, requirements to have a platform where to discuss and also to agree on the ways and tools how to implement. We're looking forward to extend this format and also to have several other ways of cooperation, and we believe that it's important to extend this cooperation to other sectors like energy, transport, and digital cooperation. We are also interested to share from this experience to other Eastern Partnership countries on this DCFTA-related experience, to the ones that are interested to learn or to see from this experience. Some other priorities that we believe that additional effort could be in a way invested in practical terms for the years to come in order to have a more glasses of water or more in a way commitment, and also to have this as seeds of irreversibility and commitment, building bridges between the EU and the Eastern neighborhood. One of the elements is connectivity. This is discussed in all the majority of policies. Also, even to look in the last communication of EU-Asia, connectivity is one of the element where it's the reference to the Eastern Partnership. I think it's very important to look practically and also to put more flesh on the bones on that. An extended TNT network for the Eastern partners. We definitely will build mobility and will increase trade between us. Another element is the implementation and adoption of the external investment plan. And that was in a way worked. There was a lot of discussion on that, but still it's not in a way practical elements on that. Another element is digital. I think goes without saying, it's not just a trendy word, but it's also part of our daily lives, and it has a major potential in the future. We pay, as a country, also a high attention at the national level on this e-governance from all the sectors, from public procurement to education. But we very much believe on the this long-lasting discussion on reducing the roaming tariffs, first between the Eastern partners, but next also with EU member states. And this, we believe, it can be an important step for the integration into the EU digital market. Security is another dimension which is very important, and we had all the long-lasting discussion on that. And here, indeed, it's the area which lacks, and it needs more to have more to be beefed up. It's very sensitive because majority of us, we have unresolved conflicts, but at the same time building and investing in the security on every country, it will indirectly contribute to the common security, to stronger security in the region. We believe in the bilateral dialogue, stronger focus on the cybersecurity, more exchange of information, hybrid threats, CSDP and security sector reform are all these sectors where it's important to see practically. As a cross-cutting issue, it remains strategic communication and much about the values about the EU in the region, how EU is perceived in the region. It's still a challenge. And even in this century, when everything can be checked on Google, still myths exist. Myths exist about EU. And it's very important we join in a way forces to find a way how to in a way build, to learn, and to raise in the spirit of values of understanding what exactly EU is. Because still it's a lot of misperception what EU is in the countries from the Eastern Partnership. I would like to say a few words on the next decade of the Eastern Partnership. And I think it's very important, besides looking on what we achieved all together in this last 10 years, almost the last 10 years, I think it's very important to reflect, to have this type of brainstorming, also what we can do together beyond 2020. And I could also say maybe in this forum that it's not only EU and Eastern partners that we are really reflecting and thinking what would be in after 2020. And I really think that any gap or lack of policy encourages others to fill this gap. And I think it's important also to reflect and to see into this. I believe that it's important to have an important event and to have an important also visible, high level and visible and strategic communication on this, in a way, 10 years anniversary. It's next year, but also next year we already discussed Brexit. It's going also to be elections in the next, in the parliament, and so many other things on the plate of the EU. It's important to keep attention on Eastern Partnership and high-level messages to be in a way there. I think also, besides this symbolic nature, it's important to have the substantial outcome and maybe also a policy statement or document on this way. I think it's important to find these innovative ideas that will continue the commitment of all of us to really pursue all this agenda of difficult reforms and also to promote this inclusive approach of all of us. I think it's important also in this discussion of the next financial multilateral framework also to see the positive experience of the European Neighbourhood Instrument and how this also can practically be integrated. And maybe next year, and also as a result of the discussions of the maybe tomorrow discussion, it's important to have a reflection on the future of the partnership and maybe to come to with some more concrete results for the summit for 2020 of the Eastern Partnership. Also, I would like in a way to say, as a few in a way comments that was in a way mentioned and some of the elements which we resonate as a voice from the region. It's very important to put these elements of sectorial things which build the bridges, but in the same time it's important to keep the political dialogue and to keep these in a way messages at the highest level, because this type of commitment, embracing the values, is coming also from the top up, and it's very important to keep it in a way alive, and then to have this as a corset in terms of short and medium term. Also, it's important in this process not only to have the institutions on board, but also the member states. This effort is very difficult without the support and the openness of the member states. And also, I would like to say about following all these in a way realities. I very much resonate with what in a way mentioned, that in the future more and more the differentiated type of integrity is going in a way to be. And here it's very important to understand what are ingredients and what are different models. And exactly there's so many already ways of doing it, and still a few others that are still in the making. And it's a mixture of sectorial, political, financial, and also different in a way context in the region and also the circumstances. And I learned that in the food industry it's such in a way concept as bliss point, where it's kind of the right balance of the sweet and salty. I think it's also very important to find the way and what is typical and in the same time ambitious but realistic for our in a way region, what in this short and medium term we can in a way put as a balance and complete ingredients for sectorial, political and financial, and also to keep in mind the bigger picture and the maps, also to make it happen. Because for us, Eastern Partnership remains important. It's very much into already our national policies. It's part of the EU global strategy, and it means ownership and responsibility, and for the Republic of Moldova, it's part of our path. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Deputy Minister. Thank you, Ms. Morari, for your valuable input. And thank you to all of you on behalf of all the organizers for spending the evening with us. We hope you gain new inputs and more insights in this complex topic. We do very much look forward to our working session tomorrow with our international experts. Thank you again for coming, and we wish you all a good evening.